Welcome to the Future of Supply Chain, presented by Dynamo. Each episode, we sit down with leaders in the industry as we build the future of supply chain together. Let's get into the show. Here's our host, Santosh Sankar.
Hey, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Future Supply Chain Podcast. I'm your host, Santosh Sankar. Joining me today is Kevin O'Mara, Chief Research Officer at 0100. Welcome, Kevin. It's great to have you on.
Santosh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Totally. We're going to jump in and kind of cover a variety of topics today, but I'd love for you to just share with our listeners the quick 90-second skinny on what 0100 is.
Sure. 0100 is a research and data platform for chief operating officers and chief supply chain officers. We basically help folks running supply chains at a global level to stay ahead of AI, to stay ahead of the talent challenges, and to figure out how to build the right sort of fusion teams that bring tech and ops together.
Amazing. And the Kevin O'Mara story, how'd you get into the world of supply chain?
You know, my first job out of high school was still in high school as a shipper receiver at a retailer.
Okay.
These are button shops, as a matter of fact. It was very old school. Everything was paper, and it was kind of early days with little pigeonholes and everything else. But I sort of fell in love with this stuff when I was in business school. I went to Stanford for business school, studied operations, really dug it, wanted to work in a factory. Turns out they didn't really want me all that bad in a factory, so I ended up in consulting. But the consulting firm I joined, which was Gemini Consulting, it was a descendant of an old strategy firm called the Mac Group, ended up doing pure supply chain before we called it that. So that kind of got my sort of juices flowing. I worked in tech for a while at Oracle in the 90s, saw some really sort of crappy software being built and sold, and felt like, this could be better. So I became a researcher. I went to AMR Research, which was based in Boston, founded the original Supply Chain Council, wrote the original score model. So really early days. But we got bought by Gartner in 2010. I stayed on and ran that group at Gartner for a couple of years, I guess. And then I split, joined my current partner, Ali Sloboda, who co-founded 0100 with me, to run a group called SCM World, which we also sold to Gartner 2016. So that's 2 times. Having learned the first time that I didn't really dig it all that much, I needed more research and less kind of management. I bailed again and went to spend 3 years at Amazon, working mainly in the last mile logistics org before we peeled off and started this 0100 operation. So been at it a long time, Santosh, and kind of love it, frankly. The original supply chain top 25, that was mine. I invented that at AMR Research way back in the day. And I'm kind of the biggest cheerleader of supply chain you're ever going to find. I love what people do in this field, and I'm really kind of impressed by our clients and by anybody in the domain.
Amazing. I love that. So let's jump into it, right? When we think about supply chain, especially at Dynamo, if you were to ask our LPs, we will start our annual presentations always thinking about and reviewing the drivers of demand behind supply chain. And we tend to break that down into the consumer and industrial segments, right? Like pretty classic stuff, but for somebody doesn't think about supply chain, it might feel new, novel. But I share that because we all think of supply chain as a function of supply and demand. And the interesting thing that your research has suggested is that we've been unbalanced or imbalanced in favor of demand for quite a long time. And I'd love to kind of expand and elaborate on this.
Yeah.
But please.
It's a great question. I love the way you guys think about it. Yes, of course, it's demand and supply. And early days, all that history I gave you from my own perspective, way back to Oracle in the 90s, we were putting technology into the supply side. If you think really old days, when there was a data processing room at the back of the factory and it had a little mini computer in it and it's, green screen coding, that was the early investment on the supply side. And it went pretty heavy. SAP and Oracle and some of the databases and some of the CAD systems. That was a very heavy push into the supply side. Well, the demand side was just barcodes at a retail outlet. That was kind of it. Enter e-commerce, enter the .com, and in particular, enter Amazon. And all of a sudden, the explosion on the demand side is enormous. It's not just the e-commerce either. The thing we've seen a lot of investment in is really consumer level demand data, manipulation, creation, and so forth. So think of social media, right? Meta, and its change in the way people sort of express their wants and loves and hates and everything else. TikTok and so forth. We talked a lot about TikTok. That collection of digital data and the systems that bring it into usability has seen, we think, at least a 6-to-1 favorable ratio in terms of investment in new capital, in volume of data, and in volume of transactions. It's a pretty rough number, and it's based on looking at some of the R&D spend of the supply-oriented tech from the demand-oriented tech. But the bottom line is, where once supply was king, in the last 10 years, the demand side has become overpowered, and the consumer, including the customer, whether it's a B2B or it's a retailer, is basically more powerful than the supply side by a factor of 6. Again, is the number we throw around.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's a multiple.
And you mentioned TikTok briefly, and the way we discovered 0100 is because we stumbled onto some of the work you've done around the TikTok supply chain, which is just fascinating. Let's unpack some of that. I'd love to kind of, I guess, begin with just some essential knowledge to set the scene for our audience, because I don't know if everybody is necessarily on TikTok, familiar with it.
Right.
I just want to level set before we press forward.
Yeah, TikTok is a social media app that just exploded. In terms of the amount of time per day that the average user is on TikTok actively, it's something like 20-fold the typical, let's say, Facebook app. And that varies by demographic, and it has changed significantly through time. The data gathered by TikTok when you're engaging with TikTok is incredibly rich. How long do you linger? How frequently do you swipe? What do you go back to? What do you forward? What do you comment, et cetera? Now, it's not as though Facebook doesn't do this too. TikTok, however, has just gotten so unbelievably good at using images, video, and that sort of connect relationship to suck people in and keep them in place. So it's a transformative system. And partially it's because the content creation on TikTok is effectively all free. So compared to other content platforms, think of Netflix. You're not paying to have that content. You have an incredible productivity advantage in terms of the content, which allows the consumer to be lavish. They can go ripping through images and they know that there's always another one coming. All that adds up to an incredibly rich picture of what every individual, and then aggregated up to a total, wants, loves, hates, is scared of, is driven by. So it's reptilian, actually, how deeply they get, into your soul and make you do things that you don't even necessarily know you're doing. That's what TikTok is like through the user experience. It's a huge lever in terms of thinking of demand data. And that, again, back to the conversation of supply chain, this is largely untapped from a supply chain planning perspective because the richness is just beyond what anybody uses for traditional forecasting in a supply chain context. Forecasting in supply chain is pretty basic, to be perfectly honest. What was last year? What's happening this year? What happens in the winter versus the summer? Do we have a promotion? We're going to get a little uplift. That's very old school, very macro, very based on barcode, data polls from your retailers. TikTok opens this vast thousandfold, more than thousandfold even, increase in the sort of visibility to what the consumer is really thinking. So that's why it's kind of a really exciting break point in the supply-demand balancing equation you originally talked about.
And I do want to kind of ask for a moment about the concept of forecasting, right? Because like as a VC, we get in any given year several dozen pitches. Everybody kind of has a new novel way to access hard to get data, or perhaps run it through a certain model or algorithm they feel to be more privileged or proprietary than a competitor. But equally, then, like I've turned to chief supply chain officers who say, yeah, like we're actually pretty good on our forecasts. Like, our error rates are 1% to 2% until marketing shows up and tells us that Monday morning they're going to do a promotion that we hadn't included, but we haven't changed the ways we've done forecasting, nor are we interested in being a buyer of some of these new novel products. What's behind this? Like, it feels like there's clearly a need, but
Yeah.
there's not really a buyer, and I have no idea who these startups might be selling to as a result.
You are right, Santosh, that there is a sort of a mismatch between what's possible and what's normal. What's normal is based on that old world I described, where putting in ERP systems and old-fashioned supply chain planning systems. The sales and operations planning meeting, S&OP, is one of the great pillars of supply chain. The problem is it has this great long history of being like weekly or even monthly. And it's like, really? I mean, that's how frequently we're going to take a crack at forecasting demand. The fact is, it's totally normal to forecast steady rate demand for certain products, consumables like, dairy, for instance. You can be pretty darn accurate at that stuff. A promotion comes along, your point about marketing. They need to move a top line. They want to push somebody else off the shelf. Maybe it's, a new product launch that they want to definitely be successful no matter what happens. They'll do a BOGO on it, buy one, get one. They'll do a deep promotion. They'll do you name it. And all of a sudden you spike demand. That's something that a forecasting system will build in if the relationship is tight enough between marketing and ops that they're kind of on the same page. None of this stuff, however, is anywhere near as fast as what the TikTok supply chain is basically focused on. It's how to have an instant of demand, by which I mean for 10 hours, there will be a spike in demand for a certain item that is being featured by an influencer. And that spike may be a very, very small group. It could be 400 individuals. And if they think they'll buy that item, there will immediately be a flow out from a job request, basically, to a factory, a tier factory that works for any one of these apparel makers, who will say, I'll do that. I'll make 400 units. Boom. The influencer has got 400 people's worth of enthusiasm, spread all over the world, by the way. And they say, we'll take the order, we'll ship the order, and off it goes. And they go straight around the entire supply chain. That is demand sense and respond that is unbelievably fast. So Shein, who lives in this world, they'll do 70,000 styles a year or something like that. Not a handful, not dozens. That's a very different kind of forecasting than kind of stuff that your partners are seeing when you introduce the typical forecasting tool, which is really just an upgrade on what's always been in place in supply chain.
That's amazing. I'm going to jump back into TikTok territory for a bit. TikTok is largely considered to be the haunts of Gen Z. And you're seeing kind of Gen Z start to make their ascent now into society. They're taking jobs in the corporate world. I would say even kind of the older cohort of this generation are starting to get into kind of the territory where they are becoming middle managers. They have disposable income. All that said, is it fair to say like this demand isn't going away? Is this going to persist?
I think it's fair to say that, yes, Santosh. It's not just that this Gen Z crowd is going to grow up, become, the middle managers of the world. They are. It's that the entire sort of culture of digesting content has fully baked itself into, and I'm holding, my mobile device. The device in hand is the way that we consume content. And increasingly, that's the way that we want to shop. We want to be, get suggestions for products. We want to offer a review. We want to criticize. We want to share. We want to, rain holy hell on a particular product. So Gen Z will graduate up. There'll be somebody behind them, and they will be even more attached to their devices. The device itself may change, but you know how slowly the form factor of something that's really established changes. The form factor of an automobile is essentially the exact same as it was when Henry Ford rolled the Model T off. It's the same form factor. Well, guess what? We're probably going to have this form factor for as long as we have front pockets that sort of slide right up against our thighs. I don't see this going away anytime soon. So yeah, it's here to stay. It is not a fad.
And so kind of pushing forward, right? A lot of what you've described is what I call social selling. And this is definitely something in Asian cultures in the last decade has emerged. TikTok having Chinese origins itself, Temu and Shein, who are then using this as a channel for what maybe we call just-in-time fast fashion, the way you described kind of the forecasting capabilities that it enables. All of this has repercussions around sustainability.
Yeah.
And this is something I've been a bit fascinated by, because for some, sustainability could be a trend. In parts of the world like Europe, it's very real. There's regulation being built around it. Best practices are changing.
Yeah.
But this generation that are ravenous, rabid users of TikTok also prioritize, especially sustainability, as they are acting as consumers.
Yeah.
How does this all come together? Is it going to end bad? Is it going to maybe make way for a truly circular supply chain at some point, given the change that's already occurred?
Yeah,
I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know that was a mouthful.
It's a great, no, it's fantastic setup, Santosh, honestly, because it's this terrible sort of like yin and yang that's going on here, which is, yeah, Shein and Temu, and by the way, Amazon's following with their own capability. It's the same thing. And this is going to happen in a lot of places. The buyer, the sort of typical young fashion enthusiast who's influenced by the influencers and goes ahead and grabs it at these low price points, they don't have information about sustainability, right? They really don't understand it. They have this very sort of localized kind of mythical sense of sustainability. So they'll do things like be real careful about not using plastic straws. You know what? That doesn't move the needle. What moves the needle is actually understanding the flow of production and sourcing and logistics backwards to raw materials. That's something that is actually a bit of an opportunity. So for a while, I think the yin on this is they will be sucking resources out of the planet, turning it into rags and throwing it out literally into the trash for a while still. The outrage at this, and Europe is pushing hard on regs for this right now, of course. The outrage, I think, will lead to some regulation, yes, and that's going to make a difference. But the really big difference will be the whole conversation we just had about the way people consume content on these mobile devices, whether TikTok or otherwise, is the exact same platform you need. Lead push. Unilever has tried to do this for years. Columbia Sportswear does this. Lightfoot has tried to do a fair amount of this. Put more information in the hands of the consumer, and it's possible that the yang comes back and they start to say to themselves, I get it. I am still feeding this demand channel that we talked about. And so you're learning me real fast, but I'm no longer asking for something that's going to be trash really quickly. There is actually a product, Joro.com, which is a little startup that tracks my carbon. It's not the same thing I'm talking about, but it's the beginning of that movement. I do think that that's the ultimate, is give the information to these consumers.
I love that. Stepping forward here, as you take a step back, what are the suggestions you might have for somebody designing a TikTok supply chain, if you would? Are there key things they absolutely need to account for or have top of mind in order to be successful on the other side?
Yeah, they are. I mean, the most important thing isn't really about analyzing the demand side data, because people are already doing that ad nauseum. As well, TikTok, it's Shein's entire business model is that. It's all on the supply side. Have your supply chain organization, whether it's your planning people, your sourcing people, your manufacturing logistics people, people who design the packaging, all of those people, depends a little on who you are, but you pick where you have the biggest impact. You make sure those supply chain folks are synced up with the demand chain data. And so the idea is, what can I learn from the TikTok data that we are, and it's not just TikTok, keep in mind, it's any kind of social media or commerce online data. What can I learn about the way our operations work that would translate into buying information for those customers?
So, Kevin, with kind of all that said around the key pieces of a supply chain capability to support, social selling, whether it's TikTok or something else, the question I have is, who is doing this already in a successful manner? Are there certain standouts that you run into that are able to maybe already adapt, or maybe they've engineered from, a completely blank sheet of paper, this type of operation that can get us goods, via Shein or Temu in a matter of 24, 48 hours based on what we've consumed?
Yeah, I think I'll give you 3 layers of answer. One is Shein. We did a deep dive on Shein. Shein team was same thing, but Shein, we did some detailed analysis. And what we learned was it's not just about the demand, it's also about the supply. And it's not just about the supply, it's about the way you engage the supply. In other words, you have kind of a gig economy approach to factory capacity, which means they have thousands of suppliers. They don't have a few factories, and they don't own those suppliers. They work with those suppliers. A little bit like we see in consumer electronics with contract manufacturing on the back end. Let's imagine the whole thing speeding up. Shein does that and kind of is the poster boy for TikTok supply chain. I'll take you down a level into the slightly realer world to Amazon, where I worked myself. Amazon is pretty close. Amazon has incredibly precise, up to the minute, detailed information about what the shopper's looking for. The buy page, when you're on there buying from Amazon, and this isn't necessarily social, but as often as not, it's on a mobile device, so it's mobile commerce, is just dozens and dozens of data points that gather information about what you really want. The ability to very quickly feed that back into, okay, so should I ship it from Orlando or from Jacksonville? That's the back end fully evolved. That's the supply chain with kind of a service-oriented architecture running very precise little apps to solve very precise little problems, like which fulfillment center to pull from, and whether we should bundle this with another package. Those kinds of decisions are all done instantaneously. That is working very well right now. And Amazon is chasing the cost and speed levels of Shein. They are also using factories that are not their own. They're using factories that are either branded manufacturers or third-party, white label, whatever. So they're pretty close. If I go into the real world, by which I mean regular companies, I'm going to say Procter & Gamble. And why do I say Procter & Gamble? Because Procter & Gamble, they're not really they don't have influencers out there persuading you to buy a dress, obviously. But they do have a very deep, active, direct-to-consumer demand management capability that, and this is the critical part, ties back to a really great interconnected end-to-end supply chain. So they're able to take that demand data, and if they want, respond immediately with ship from a, mixing center, if you like, a specific product. That's not necessarily what they want to do, but they're able to do it. So Shein on the high end, Amazon, one step down in the real world. P&G is capable, I would say, of doing this now if they want to. The question is, when do they want to? How does it serve their brands? Where does it lead to more growth, bigger baskets, more rebuy? And that's where I suspect that there's work going on the demand analytics side, the marketing and brand management side, that puts them in a spot where all those supply chain investments are going to be faster to close the deal with the consumer. 3 levels, I think, of TikTok supply chain immaturity.
That's fascinating. So I'm going to bring us home here, Kevin, with what I call this or that. It's kind of one of the fun ways that I like to wrap up episodes. I'm going to give you 2 choices. What I would like in return is you're going to pick a choice and explain why in about 20 seconds. You ready to go?
Yes, I
am. TikTok or Instagram? As the millennial host, I am.
I got to say TikTok, not because it's millennial, but because it is sticky beyond all possible belief. And the precision with which they know what you want, which I don't, dispute Instagram's competence. It's just the sort of, zeitgeist. So that's the king.
Yeah. Air freight or ocean cargo?
Ocean, always. I mean, ocean is great from a sustainability standpoint. And if you have your act together, no problem that it's on the ocean for 6 weeks, 2 months. It's really the reward for having your act together in supply chain that you can afford to go the inexpensive, low carbon footprint mode of shipping it on a boat.
And lastly, supply or demand?
That's a good one. Oh boy, I got to say supply. I mean, demand is king, but supply is the thing that once solved, and we're working on it 24 hours a day, will give us 0-100 supply chains. They will persistently support the needs of the human race forever, starting in the year about 2050, mid-century, when we level off at 10 billion people. It will all be about whether or not supply has found that sweet spot of keeping us all fed, clothed, and taken care of. And I think supply is really the answer to solving that meta problem of how do we really keep this planet going.
With that, Kevin, much appreciated sharing kind of your wisdom on what I find to be a fascinating topic that I don't think enough people are necessarily talking about. So with that, we'll continue to tune into your research and the good stuff you have coming through at 0-100.
Thank you, Santosh. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Thanks for watching. Follow us at dynamo.vc for all the latest episodes. We'll see you next time.